Hello everybody, welcome to BirGün History of Science Conversations. Well, today we have a historian of science, so today's guest is Professor Rebekah Higgitt'i. Welcome, Rebekah.
Thank you.
Welcome to Istanbul, of course.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Nice to have you here. If you're ready, I'm going to ask the first question.
I'm ready, yeah.
Okay. In this series, conversation series, I'd like to know how people of different professions started, initiated their interests in their work. So the first question is, what inspired you to specialize in the history of science, particularly in the fields of astronomy and maritime navigation? So can you tell me your story?
So I began by studying history, which is something interesting about history of science. I find is that people come to it from lots of different directions. People are often study science and then get interested in history, or sometimes they come from history or sociology or anthropology, all those different areas, and then they come together. So history of science, I think, is lively as a discipline because it has that different backgrounds of people. But I was a historian first. And really, I came across history of science by accident, which I think is often also the case. I was studying a master's in 17th century studies at the University of Durham. And I'd had a friend previously who'd studied physics and philosophy. And she had said she had a great professor, Professor David Knight at Durham.
David Knight?
David Knight.
Oh.
She said he's a really nice man. He does great lectures. You might be interested to work with him. So I did.
I'm friends with Harriet Knight.
Ah, very good.
Yes, yes.
So yes, it was just because I had this recommendation. I was interested in the history of ideas broadly. Where do we, what's the background to things that we believe in, or how have things changed over time? And then I worked with him and realised that history of science was really interesting.
Yes.
And I didn't look back from there. But that was when I was doing my PhD, which was on biographies of Isaac Newton.
Yes.
So I was looking at how in the 19th century, when science was becoming a profession, how did people think about Newton as a revered figure, as a genius in science, as a hero for British science? So I was looking at texts. I was interested in the idea of the nature of science and people who pursue it. So it's a little bit different from what I moved on to, which was looking at the history of astronomy and navigation. And that was really because after also doing postdoctoral work, I got a job at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich and the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. So I moved from working mainly with texts and archives to a museum setting. I knew quite a lot about the history of the observatory and the Royal Astronomical Society. Those were all very relevant to what I'd worked on with Newton. But I was a novice really in working with objects and instruments, but I was allowed to train on the job, as it were,
yes.
and to learn something about astronomy and how you navigate with astronomy. Yeah.
The genesis of your interest and work in the history of science, the biographies of Newton, which, I'm interested in working on Newton and Newtonianism. What I would like to ask you is that the biographies in the 19th century, among other things, were they a reputation-building exercise?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, Newton's reputation was already very high.
Yeah.
So in his lifetime, unusually, he was very, very famous. He was buried at Westminster Abbey in London. He was, this really important figure already. So by the 19th century, he is established as a heroic figure. He has begun to stand for British science. He, is the man who is changed the way you do astronomy, changed the way you do mathematics. He's also a British icon, so that becomes an important part of the story. Yeah. So I was looking at one French biography. Mostly I was looking at the British context, but it was interesting reading one by a Frenchman who also wants to claim, actually we in France, we learnt more from Newton than you did. So there is that national sort of rivalry that goes on. And also there's a religious story, because although Newton himself, and they were finding this out properly again, they were finding out in the 19th century that Newton was not an Orthodox Anglican Christian. He was, he didn't believe in the Trinity, and that is a big problem for somebody who's meant to be this heroic figure for the University of Cambridge and for England more broadly. And so that was one of the things they were discussing at the time was, you know, what were Newton's beliefs? Could we still claim him as, you know, someone who's a foundational figure for England, for science, for the church? And some people very strongly still defending that in the 19th century. Others saying, actually, you know, he wasn't that. But also, so it reflects their own beliefs. It reflects the way that England at the time was, you know, becoming less sort of focused on Anglicanism, and it was possible to be a dissenter and still sort of make your way through. So, for example, Augustus de Morgan wrote a lot about Newton. He was based at University College London, which was a more secular university. You didn't have to be an Anglican, unlike at Oxford and Cambridge, where you had to, you know, agree to the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church. So on.
As far, I mean, I know this, but I can't remember where I came across. When he was at the head of the Royal Society, I think he actually did a lot of power relation business where Catholics, he was an anti-Catholic, you know, obviously. But, you know, he was not that inclusive about who he wanted to be in the society. So his anti-Catholic feelings actually translated into his choice of academics, if you know what I mean, within the society. Would you agree with that?
Well, you probably know more about Newton. I know more about the people in the 19th century writing about Newton.
Yeah, all right.
But yes, I think, I mean, for Newton, I think at that period, science and religion, knowledge, natural philosophy was all much more connected. So for Newton, I think if your beliefs about the nature of God were not right, you were probably not getting your science right either. So I think he would have been, you know, suspicious of people who were coming from, you know, a different tradition.
Exactly, Public perceptions of science, which is very much related to what we're doing today, you know, public engagement and how people perceive science and scientists, scholars in general. Can you actually give us some insight into the period that you're working on, how public perceived of scientific activity or the kind of ideas about scientists, 18th and 19th centuries?
I think it's a period of huge change. So I work across 17th, 18th and 19th century. And of course, as I was mentioning, the science only became a career path, a sort of, you know, the idea of the scientist as a job you could have is very late in that history. So science, or what we call science now, was in a sense much more dispersed, I suppose, in the past. So you had mathematics being developed for very practical reasons, like navigation or time telling or whatever it might be. So there is a sort of a wide spread of people who have an interest in developing knowledge or developing scientific instruments or certain techniques. And that's quite public in a sense. And I think particularly in London in the late 17th and in the 18th century, which I've worked on a bit, you get quite a public culture of science there because there is a lot of activity around commerce, navigation, and a sort of a public interest in learning as well. So you get quite public lectures. Famously, coffee shops are places where
William Whiston,
who Newton had a big argument with.
Yes.
Although their religious beliefs weren't unaligned, but because of that, they had lots of arguments. So he is an example of someone who came to London because he had to leave Cambridge due to Newton to find another way of making a living as a mathematician. And in part, one of the things he's doing is public lecturing. You know, so there is you know, enough of a public, people who want to pay to hear more, who will buy books, who are interested in maybe buying instruments. So London is a place where the scientific instrument trade really takes off. In the 18th century, becomes the world leader for a period in this kind of thing, both for the very pragmatic worlds of commerce and navigation and so on, and for this more fashionable world of science and you know, people interested in looking through a microscope or, you know, looking at the stars. So I think science didn't have a a sort of monolithic idea of what it was or who the people were pursuing it in the past, which is also true now in the sense that there are so many sciences. We shouldn't really talk about it as one thing.
True.
Because, you know, a meteorologist is very different from, you know, someone working in the field sciences or in a laboratory. They're quite different sorts of techniques, different sort of people. No one can be an expert in all of it, I suppose. Yeah. But it also feels, because there's a lot of expertise and quite specific disciplines, people who are not trained in those areas probably feel a bit more sort of shut off. It feels less accessible than it might have been. So you perhaps get this sense of distancing because of that. But there is lots of interest
I think, yes.
people finding out more. I mean, you know that in a museum, and in Edinburgh we have the Science Festival every year, which a lot of it happens at the museum I work in. Lots and lots of people come, but quite often with their children. I think there's often this idea that
educational.
It's educational. It's maybe fun because there's a lot of, you know, hands-on things that people offer for kids to play with. And I think often you do science maybe at school, maybe give it up at that point and never think about it again until you think your children ought to. And then
yes, exactly.
you maybe go to the science museum.
Interest
Yes. But equally, I know people who, you know, maybe a member of an astronomical society and they're fascinated all their life, and you know, they're not. It's not their job, but it's their hobby.
It's their hobby. Let's actually talk about your own public engagement experience. You wrote for Guardian. And you stopped it, I think. I don't know why, but how did you find I mean, personally, my experience is if you write for public in a more, not fashionable, but in a basic way, there's a balance to strike. I always mention this when I'm having guests like you. You don't want to give away from your or dilute your expertise, but also you want to be accessible. There's always this tension. Did you feel that?
Yes, I think you have to be quite clear about, say, one thing you want to get over about the nature of science and why you think it's important. And that was hard to maintain. So for The Guardian, I can't remember how many years, they had a science blog, which had a series of, several blogs brought together under one heading, because that was the time when The Guardian was expanding online, everything online, everything first online, and put as many pages up as they possibly could. And they have since changed their model, and that was part of the reason why the blogs were ended, and they only kept you know, one or two people as sort of columnists who would continue to write for them. But at the time they had sociologists and historians and scientists of different sorts, and they would just wanted all of this information, and there was an audience for it, particularly I think because of social media. Twitter was you know, becoming very popular at that time as well, and that's where a lot of interactions happened, and I think a lot of the traffic for our blog came through that. So I worked with Vanessa Heggie, who's a historian of medicine, and I think history of medicine is always interesting to people because they feel it's very close to them. Exactly. There's a personal connection there, and you know, even if it's about a time where there were different diseases and people were treated very differently, people understand what that might have been like, and I think is an easier way in than science, which often feels a bit more disconnected from people's daily life. So for us, I found it quite difficult to find the hook. So, you know, maybe an anniversary or something that was big in the news where you could find a way of talking about something historical that would connect with that. And those, you know, only rarely come up really well that people will. So we were using things like Google Doodles. They have those anniversaries, so that's a time when everyone's maybe searching for who this person is. So that's an opportunity to give information about who Christian Huygens was, or you know, whatever. But it worked more nicely when when something like Nobel Prizes were being given out, and I would talk about, you know, write a post about the history of early prizes in science and what they mean and the way that they celebrate individuals and certain kinds of individuals, and science has never done like that. So I was, you know, this point of, you know, undercutting the genius story, undercutting the discovery story, those sorts of things I was always interested to do, and there's always a way of doing it, and it's always relevant to know that science isn't done by these, you know, really different individuals separate from the rest of the world. They are embedded in their context, they work with lots of other people. and you know, are doing work that is impacted by what's going on in the world around them. So that's always what I was trying to get across, one way or another, and just finding different ways in. So it was often not very close to my research, or wasn't a research piece.
Same.
But yes, the way that our discipline has sort of, you know, learned to understand science more broadly.
Yeah.
I did write, so one area when I was working at the Maritime Museum, we had an exhibition on the history of longitude, so navigation, finding your position at sea in longitude. We were doing a lot of work for the exhibition. We had a research project based around that at the University of Cambridge, jointly with us. We were publishing papers and so on. So there was quite a lot about that. And because it's a story people have heard of a bit, if they're interested in, partly because of Dava Sobel's very successful book, yes. Which is wrong in all sorts of ways. So that was one of the things I was trying to do.
Yeah, that's the danger.
Yeah.
But it looks as though, even though you're doing in a kind of a basic, you know, kind of popular way, you're still revising some, you know, kind of revisionist attitude in your writing.
Yes, I think that's right.
And talking about the Nobel Prizes, the next question is quite relevant here. The way that underrepresented groups are, you know, kind of talked about in science, or how they were represented, or were they? Nobel Prizes is one thing, but women in science. And actually, you helped me when I was trying to write a piece for Nature, remember? About how the criteria should be to write women's engagement with science into history.
Yes.
So what the criteria should be can be a lot of different things, but what is your take on it? I mean, what should we do? How should we do it?
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot of work now from at least the 1970s onwards about finding, you know, women who have not been, you know, they're not the canon, they are not the heroes, they are, you know, they were never quite forgotten, but sort of relegated. And there's certainly been lots of effort to write biographical dictionaries of women, or, you know, publish histories around them one way or another and understand them. And that's been really important work. But I think there's become and partly also because there's this drive to get women into STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, medicine, subjects, to study them now. There's been this drive to say there are women, there are heroic figures who are women, you as a woman could study this too and become part of the field. I think in some ways we've gone beyond that, because I think in many subjects, in the UK anyway, women are 50-50 or more going into those fields compared to men. It's a very different picture. But I think we've also gone too far in making women heroes now, in the same way that Newton was a hero. We now have Ada Lovelace or Mary Somerville.
Which presented as something that they really weren't.
That they weren't, absolutely. Which I think, you know, as a historian, I always find it problematic. I can see why it's happened. I can see why it happened for Newton and Darwin and you know, these other famous figures. It's about advocating for the subjects and the importance, and trying to get funding from government and all of this sort of thing. Exactly the same thing now, but it still means you're not telling a story that's real. So partly, you know, Marie Curie, genius, famous, you know, you can't all be a Marie Curie, probably. No. It's just not true. There are many other people who also contribute to science.
Exactly. Ordinary lives of, you know, people who were genuinely interested in scientific enterprise, but you should be studied as much as the heroes, you know.
Yeah, and also I think it means you lose some of the things about the past that were important. So Ada Lovelace, as the woman who worked with Charles Babbage in helping the public understand the nature of his calculating machines, so the difference engine and the analytical engine. She did something that is a role that women did have, which was to popularise. That was something that in the past women were writers and they were educators, and that was a niche that was okay for them to be in, whereas as being in a professional sphere just wouldn't have been possible in the past. So I think we need to understand that she was
they were already there.
Yeah, yeah. And she was there and she knew Babbage because she was wealthy. She was the daughter of an aristocrat. And I think that story we should never lose sight of, is how much the privileged people are the ones we hear about. And it's not only, you know, the question of gender and who, you know, gets to speak. It's also the question of who had wealth and privilege and connections.
It's a class issue, isn't it?
So I think when focusing sometimes on that story about women, we then forget that there is, you know, all the men who never had a chance to be a scientist because they were working class and weren't educated.
I remember you and I wrote each other about that.
Yes,
we did. I remember that. Okay, so you already mentioned your work at the Royal Observatory, Greenwich. The scientific instruments you are interested in and work on is a simple question. I mean, why are you interested in them? What do they tell you, you know?
It's a good question. I mean, partly because it's my job, and that's, you know, where I've ended up working is in museums. And, you know, whereas as universities have students to teach, we have, you know, objects that we need to catalogue, interpret, share with the public. I think, as I mentioned to you, I was when I started working at the observatory, I was, you know, not a specialist in instruments or material culture of science, and I had to learn. I was not a specialist in astronomy either, but having the instruments was a good way to learn a bit of astronomy, particularly if you're looking at, I mean, if you're looking at, you know, 21st century telescopes. They are complicated, they are big, they have many different instruments, they're working with many different wavelengths of light, they're hard to interpret. But if you're looking at an 18th century mural quadrant or something, it's quite obvious what you're doing. There is a degree scale, there is a telescope, and you can see that by pointing the telescope at a particular star, you're going to be measuring its height. And then you can start to learn about meridian astronomy and how you're timing the crossing of the star across your local meridian. And that's such an important story for Greenwich as the location for 0 degrees longitude. Its meridian was the meridian. So for me, working with the instruments helped me to understand the science and helped me to understand what it was the people were doing at the observatory and why that was important, and it was funded by government and so on. Now I work at National Museums Scotland, and I work with a much wider range of instruments and periods, disciplines, and I think some of it is very difficult to interpret, particularly modern instruments that are grey boxes, black boxes, white boxes, and you know, they don't say very much to people. They are, you know, the hands are off. I mean, even for the scientists using them, they may not know what's going on inside because they, you know, press a button and it does the thing they need it to do. So I think those can be very, very difficult to interpret, and that's a challenge for historians who need to collect not just the object but also the instruction manual, the stories. You know, ideally, you know, maybe if it's a sort of one of those computer consoles, you collect everything that's there, the pictures, things, the mugs, you know, to get the sense of the people working with it. But then we also have the beautiful things. So, you know, the 18th century instruments, the brass, the glass, the silver, the ivory, all of this sort of thing. And those are just lovely to look at. They're not, again, not always obvious, so they take some explanation. Something, you know, sundials, astrolabes. People don't know how they work. They know they're very beautiful to look at.
Yeah, pretty, but...
and then there's a question of, you know, how much do you want to tell them? You want to be able to provide it for people who are interested to know, but you don't want to hit people over the head if they don't really want to understand.
Particularly
you know,
interested.
So it's about weighing up those different things.
Well, I want to talk about your museum work, but shall we do it in the second part?
Yes, that sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.